Chapter 19. Of the Adventures of Ferdinand, Count Fathom, by Tobias Smollett. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Nothing else of moment was transacted during that campaign, and in the winter our adventurer, with the young Count, and his friend the Tyrolese, were disposed in quarters of cantonment, where Ferdinand made himself amends for the chagrin he had undergone, by the exercise of those talents in which he excelled. Not that he was satisfied with the sphere of life in which he acted. Though he knew himself consummate in the art of play, he was not at all ambitious of a gamester's name, nor did he find himself disposed to hazard those discoveries and explanations to which heroes of that class are sometimes necessarily exposed. His aim was to dwell among the tents of civil life, undisturbed by quarrels and the din of war, and render mankind subservient to his interest, not by stratagems which irritate, but by that suppleness of insinuation which could not fail to soothe the temper of those on whom he meant to prey. He saw that all his expectations of Count Melvil's future favour were connected with his choice of a military life, and that his promotion in the service would, in a great measure, depend upon his personal behaviour in such emergencies as he did not at all wish to encounter. On the other hand, he confided so much in his own dexterity and address, that he never doubted of being able to rear a splendid fortune for himself, provided he could once obtain a fixed and firm foundation. He had in fancy often enjoyed a prospect of England, not only as his native country, to which, like a true citizen, he longed to be united, but also as the land of promise, flowing with milk and honey, and abounding with subjects on which he knew his talents would be properly exercised. These reflections never occurred without leaving a strong impression upon the mind of our adventurer, which influenced his deliberations in such a manner as at length amounted to a perfect resolution of withdrawing himself privately from a service that teemed with disagreeable events, and of transporting himself into the country of his ancestors, which he considered as the Canaan of all able adventurers. But, previous to his appearance on that stage, he was desirous of visiting the metropolis of France, in which he hoped to improve himself in the knowledge of men and things, and acquire such intelligence as would qualify him to act a more important part upon the British scene. After having for some time indulged these prospects in secret, he determined to accommodate himself with the company and experience of the Tyrolese, whom, under the specious title of an associate, he knew he could convert into a very serviceable tool in forwarding the execution of his own projects. Accordingly, the inclination of this confederate was sounded by distant hints, and being found apt, our hero made him privy to his design of decamping without beat of drum, though at the same time he begged his advice touching the method of their departure, that he might retire with as much delicacy as the nature of such a step would permit. Divers consultations were held upon this subject, before they adhered to the resolution of making their escape from the army after it should have taken the field in the spring, because, in that case, they would have frequent opportunities of going abroad on foraging parties, and, during one of these excursions, might retire in such a manner as to persuade their companions that they had fallen into the enemy's hands. Agreeable to this determination, the camp was no sooner formed in Alsace, than our associates began to make preparations for their march, and had already taken all the previous measures for their departure, when an accident happened, which our hero did not fail to convert to his own advantage. This was no other than the desertion of Renaldo's valet, who, in consequence of a gentle chastisement, which he had richly merited, thought proper to disappear, after having plundered his master's portmanteau, which he had forced open for the purpose. Ferdinand, who was the first person that discovered the theft, immediately comprehended the whole adventure, and, taking it for granted that the delinquent would never return, resolved to finish what the fugitive had imperfectly performed. Being favoured with the unreserved confidence of the young Count, he instantly had recourse to his bureau, the locks of which he found means to burst open, and, examining a private drawer, contrived with great art to conceal Renaldo's jewels and cash, made himself master of the contents without hesitation. Then, cutting open his cloak bag, and strewing the tent with his linen and clothes, began to raise his voice and produce such a clamour as alarmed the whole neighbourhood, and brought a great many officers into the tent. He, on this, as on all other occasions, performed his cue to a miracle, expressing confusion and concern so naturally in his gestures and exclamation, that no man could possibly suspect his sincerity. Nay, to such a degree of finesse did his cunning amount, that when his friend and patron entered, in consequence of an intimation he soon received of his loss, our adventurer exhibited undoubted signs of distraction and delirium, and, springing upon Renaldo with all the frantic fury of a bedlamite, "Villain," cried he, "restore the effects you have stole from your master, or you shall be immediately committed to the care of the Prevot." However mortified Monsieur de Melville might be at his own misfortune, the condition of his friend seemed to touch him more nearly. He undervalued his own loss as a trifle that could be easily repaired, said everything which he thought would tend to soothe and compose the agitation of Ferdinand, and finally prevailed upon him to retire to rest. The calamity was wholly attributed to the deserter, and Renaldo, far from suspecting the true author, took occasion from his behaviour on this emergency to admire him as a mirror of integrity and attachment. In such an exquisite manner did he plan all his designs, that almost every instance of his fraud furnished matter of triumph to his reputation. Having thus profitably exercised his genius, this subtle politician thought it high time to relinquish his military expectations, and secured all his valuable acquisitions about his own person, rode out with his understrapper in the midst of 50 dragoons, who went in quest of forage. While the troopers were employed in making up their trusses, the two adventurers advanced towards the skirt of a wood, on pretence of reconnoitring, and the Tyrolese, who undertook to be our hero's guide, directing him to a path which leads towards Strasburg. They suddenly vanished from the eyes of their companions, who, in a few minutes, hearing the report of several pistols, which the confederates purposely fired, conjectured that they had fallen in with a party of French, by whom they were made prisoners of war. The Tyrolese had overrated his own knowledge when he took upon himself the charge of conducting our hero; for upon their arrival at a certain place, where two roads crossed each other, he chanced to follow that which not only frustrated their intention, but even led them directly to the French camp, so that in the twilight they fell in upon one of the outguards before they were aware of their mistake. Whatever confusion and perplexity they might undergo, when they heard themselves questioned by the sentinel on the advanced post, certain it is, they betrayed no symptoms of fear or disorder. But while Ferdinand endeavoured to recollect himself, his fellow traveller, with the appearance of admirable intrepidity and presence of mind, told the soldier that he and his companion were two gentlemen of family, who had quitted the Austrian army, on account of having sustained some ill usage, which they had no opportunity of resenting in any other way, and that they were come to offer their services to the French general, to whose quarters they desired to be immediately conveyed. The sentinel, to whom such an instance of desertion was neither rare nor indeed uncommon, directed them without scruple to the next post, where they found a sergeant's party, from which, at their request, they were transmitted to the officer of the Grand Guard, and by him next morning introduced to Count Coigny, who very politely received them as volunteers in the army of France. Though this translation was not at all to our hero's liking, he was forced to acquiesce in his fate, glad to find himself on these terms, in possession of his effects, of which he would otherwise have been infallibly rifled. This campaign, however, was the most disagreeable period of his whole life, because the manner in which he had entered into the service subjected him to the particular observation and notice of the French officers, so that he was obliged to be very alert in his duty, and summon all his fortitude to maintain the character he had assumed. What rendered this situation still more unpalatable was the activity of both armies in the course of this season, during which, over and above sundry fatiguing marches and counter marches, he was personally engaged in the affair of Halle, which was very obstinate, where, being in the skirts of the detachment, he was actually wounded in the face by the sword of a hussar. But this was, luckily for him, the last time he found himself under the necessity of exerting his military prowess, for a cessation of arms was proclaimed before he was cured of his wound, and peace concluded about the end of the campaign. During his sojourn in the French camp, he assumed the character of a man of family, who, being disgusted at some supercilious treatment he had met with in the German service, and at the same time ambitious of carrying arms under the banners of France, took the opportunity of retreating by stealth from his friends, accompanied only by one with whom he could entrust his intention. In this capacity he had managed his matters to such advantage, that many French officers of rank were very well disposed to contribute their interest in his behalf, had his inclination verged towards promotion in the army. But he thought proper to conceal his real design under the specious pretext of longing to see the metropolis of France, that centre of pleasure and politeness, in which he proposed to spend some time for the improvement of his address and understanding. These were motives too laudable to be opposed by his new patrons, some of whom furnished him with letters of recommendation to certain noblemen of the first rank at the court of Versailles, for which place he and his companion set out from the banks of the Rhine, very well satisfied with the honourable dismission they had obtained from a life of inconvenience, danger, and alarm. Chapter 19.